In the hills of St. Anne Parish, where mist clung to the treetops and roosters marked the hours, a boy was born with the morning sun. His name was Robert Nestor Marley. The village of 9 Miles was no more than a scattering of wooden homes tucked into Jamaica's green interior. There were footpaths instead of streets, goats grazing by roadside fences, and long silences between the sounds of conversation. It was not a place to be hurried. Cedella Malcolm was just 18 when she gave birth to Bob. Her skin was dark, her voice strong, and her will even stronger. She came from a line of proud, working women who knew how to till the land and live by their hands. His father, Norval Sinclair Marley, was 50 years old. A white Jamaican of English descent, Norval had once served in the British colonial forces and now lived mostly apart, distant in every sense. His visits were rare, and his role in Bob's life was mostly paperwork. In those earliest years, Bob grew up with the rhythms of the earth, the call of the peafowl, the hush of banana leaves in the breeze, and the soft lull of lullabies sung by Cedella at dusk. Theirs was a life of simplicity, marked by little money, but much closeness. The house where Bob lived was made of timber and set high on a hill. From its porch, you could see the sweep of the valley and the winding trails that led to neighbors' homes. Most mornings began with cornmeal porridge and chores. Afternoons were for wandering barefoot, chasing dragonflies, or lying in the shade of ackee trees. Cedella worked long hours but always returned with a story or a song, which she shared like gifts. From a young age, Bob seemed different, observant, thoughtful, and drawn to sound. He would tap rhythms on water buckets, hum melodies from church services, and listen closely when older folks sang mento songs by lamplight. Music found him early and stayed like a second heart. But 9 Miles was also a place of boundaries. Opportunities were few, and mixed-race children like Bob often felt adrift between worlds. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with pity. Cedella bore it all with patience, telling him stories of Ethiopian kings and heroes, and insisting he was made for something beyond the hills. When Bob was around 5 years old, his father arranged to take him away, not out of love, but formality. Bob was brought to live briefly in Kingston, a city he barely knew, with people he didn't understand. The separation from Cedella was sharp and strange. In that short time, he learned about loneliness. But soon, as the arrangement unraveled, he returned home. Still, the spell had been broken. 9 Miles was home, but not forever. The seasons passed. Bob's hair grew thick and wild, his voice found new range, and he began asking questions no one could answer. His mother saw that spark. She made a decision that would change both their lives. One day, with few possessions and little certainty, Cedella and young Bob boarded a bus bound for Kingston. It bumped and groaned its way down winding roads, past cane fields, and into the dusty sprawl of the capital. They arrived in the neighborhood of Trenchtown, a place known for its music, its struggle, and its undeniable spirit. But that, as they say, is where another story begins. Trenchtown was a world apart from 9 Miles. The streets were louder, the buildings taller, though many leaned with time. Smoke drifted from cook fires, and the air carried the scent of salt, iron, and sweat. Children darted through alleys, vendors sang their prices, music pulsed from open windows. Cedella found a small room in a government yard, one of many concrete tenements built to house the swelling urban poor. Their new home had walls that sweated in the heat, and a zinc roof that rang like a drum during rain. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Bob was still a boy, wide-eyed and quiet, watching it all. The adjustment was slow. He missed the hills, the hush, the smell of wet grass after a storm. But Trenchtown offered something else. People. So many people. And each one, it seemed, had a story or a song. He started school in the city and found himself drifting between classmates. Some days he was picked on for his mixed heritage. Other days he found allies. He didn't yet know where he belonged, but he carried himself with an odd kind of calm. Teachers noticed it. So did neighbours. After classes, he would walk the lanes and sit near the corner shops just listening. Older boys strummed makeshift guitars. Girls clapped and sang riddims. A man named Joe Higgs lived nearby, a local musician who often gave informal music lessons on his porch. Bob listened from a distance at first, then slowly moved closer. It was Joe who introduced Bob to the discipline of music: breath control, harmony, lyric, meaning. Joe believed in roots and rhythms and taught that music wasn't just a sound but a vessel. Bob absorbed every word. Sedella worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. At times she cleaned houses, other times she sold produce. When things got tough, she turned to faith. Bob watched her strength and learned the quiet power of endurance. As he grew into his teens, Bob began to sing more boldly, first at home, then with friends. His voice had a raw edge, but also a warmth that drew people in. He started writing, scribbling lines about life and longing, about justice and joy. His guitar, a hand-me-down with worn frets, became his closest companion. The yards of Trenchtown were often places of hardship, but they also held joy. Nights were filled with music. Weekends saw dancing and laughter. Radios played American soul, R&B, and calypso, but the heartbeat of the streets was ska, fast, brassy, infectious. Bob studied it all. He became friends with a boy named Neville Livingston, later known as Bunny. They shared records, practiced harmonies, and dreamed of making their own mark. Soon, they met another young singer with a sharp voice and sharper wit, Peter Tosh. The three of them began to sing together, blending their styles and sharpening their sound. In a yard full of dreamers, their harmony was something rare. By the time Bob was 16, the idea of becoming a musician wasn't just a wish, it was a direction, a compass, pointing towards something still distant but deeply felt. And though the road ahead would twist through rejection and heartbreak, through politics and prophecy, the seed had been planted. The boy from 9 miles was becoming the man who would change music forever. By the early 1960s, Kingston had become the beating heart of Jamaica's musical awakening. It wasn't polished, it wasn't planned, but it was powerful. Trenchtown especially was alive with sound. Every alley was an echo chamber, every yard a stage. Radios crackled with American soul and doo-wop, but something local was taking shape, something that moved with a different pulse. Ska had arrived, fast, syncopated, and brimming with brass. Ska was Jamaica's first real pop music. It lifted spirits and let people dance away their struggle. It played at nightclubs, poured from open doors, and floated over zinc rooftops. And in the middle of it all were 3 young men, Bob, Bunny, and Peter, singing in tight harmony in makeshift studios and concrete yards. They called themselves the Wailers. The name wasn't a reference to sadness, it was a declaration. They were wailing against poverty, against silence, against being overlooked. Their sound was rough at first, their equipment borrowed, and their performances unpaid, but their drive was unmistakable. Bob especially brought a quiet intensity. He didn't speak much in interviews or crowds, but when he sang, there was conviction. He didn't just want to make music, he wanted to say something. In those days, the group walked from one studio to another, hoping for a chance. Kingston had many: Studio 1, Treasure Isle, Beverly's, each with its own crowd and sound. Some producers turned them away, others gave them a chance. Clement, Coxone. Dodd was one of the first to see their potential. At Studio 1, he offered them time, guidance, and most of all, belief. It was a place where many stars were born, and now it became their home. They rehearsed tirelessly. Peter brought grit and guitar, Bunny brought harmony and soul. Bob brought the spark. Under Coxone's watch, they recorded early tracks like Simmer Down, aimed at calming the youth violence sweeping Kingston. The song became a hit. Suddenly they weren't just hopefuls, they were voices. But success was uneven, money was scarce. And the streets of Kingston were still unpredictable. Political tensions were rising. Gang leaders had started to act like warlords. Every neighborhood had sides. Still, the Wailers pressed on. By day they recorded and rehearsed. By night they listened to Otis Redding, Curtis Mayfield, and James Brown. studying the art of soul and resistance. They absorbed these influences and filtered them through their own truth. Their lyrics began to shift from light romance to deep reflections on survival, injustice, and hope. Bob was emerging as the principal songwriter. His words carried weight even when they were simple. He sang about hunger, longing, and the search for something higher. He wasn't trying to sound like anyone else. He was trying to sound like himself. At home, Sedella watched with quiet pride. She still worked tirelessly and still prayed nightly. Her son was growing into his calling, though the road was rocky. Fame was not yet secure, nor was food always certain. And yet, the music never stopped. Trenchtown's yards had become more than just rehearsal spaces. They were laboratories. In those open courtyards, ideas were traded as easily as food. Rhythms passed from one group to another. Voices overlapped in harmony and argument. The Wailers stood among many young musicians, but their hunger ran deeper. They weren't just looking for fame. They were searching for a language, but one that could carry both joy and justice. They found it in rhythm. Bob began to shift his writing toward what felt real. He sang about betrayal, resilience, and the spirit of the ghetto. Songs like Rude Boy didn't glamorize violence. They captured the conflict inside the youth who felt pushed to fight. The Wailers became chroniclers of their time. The music changed too. Ska slowed down, the horns softened, the bass deepened. A new style emerged, heavier, hypnotic, made for swaying rather than sprinting. Reggae. It was not born all at once. It crept in slowly, one drumbeat at a time, but once it took root, it transformed everything. And Bob, with his growing voice and vision, began to ride its wave. As reggae evolved, so did the Wailers' sense of purpose. They were no longer just singers, they were messengers. And Bob, still soft-spoken offstage, was starting to carry a spiritual fire. He read books on African history, followed local preachers, and opened his mind to new truths. It was around this time that he first encountered the teachings of Rastafari. At first, it was a whisper, a friend's word, a flyer, but soon it became a call. Rastas spoke of repatriation, of resistance to Babylon, of black pride, and the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. To many, it was a fringe belief. To Bob, it felt like home. He began to grow his hair into dreadlocks, read scriptures in a new light, and change his diet. His lyrics, too, shifted. There was more reflection now, more purpose. The faith didn't change who he was. It deepened what he already carried. Meanwhile, tensions within the Wailers were quietly building. Peter and Bunny were strong personalities. Each had his own ideas about where the group should go. They were still brothers in sound, but cracks had begun to form. Success hadn't yet brought money or stability, and egos strained against each other. Still, the music held them together, for now. In the concrete yards of Trenchtown, the Wailers kept rehearsing, kept refining, kept dreaming. Bob would often step outside in the early mornings, barefoot on cool stone, listening to the birds. In those quiet moments, he felt something pulling him. Not fame, not riches, but the need to be heard. He knew their songs could travel farther. He didn't yet know how far, but the sound of the yard was getting louder. The story of the Wailers was not just about music. It was about kinship. In the crowded neighborhoods of West Kingston, where daily life unfolded under corrugated roofs and threadbare clothes, Bob, Bunny, and Peter found each other not by chance, but by current. They moved through the same schoolyards, shared the same dusty roads, and carried the same hunger for sound. Each one brought something different. Bob had the heart. His songs spoke from the inside out, shaped by memories of 9 miles and the teachings of his mother. Bunny had the harmony. He could blend notes with elegance and lift a chorus to the sky. Peter had the fire. His voice cut like wind, sharp and urgent, always ready to challenge. They began singing together informally, practicing under mango trees or outside closed storefronts at night. They called themselves the Teenagers at first, then the Wailing Rude Boys. Eventually they settled on a name that fit them best, the Wailers. The name spoke of struggle, not defeat, but defiance. It echoed the sounds of the street and the cry for something more. In those early days they sang wherever someone would listen. Street corners, dance halls, school parties. Their harmony came fast and natural. They studied American groups, the Impressions, the Drifters, the Temptations, and mimicked their styles. But slowly they began to find their own. A local sound engineer named Leslie Kong gave them their first shot at recording. The result was Judge Not, Bob's very first single. He was only 16, his voice still finding its shape. The song didn't chart, but it was a beginning. Other recordings followed. Terror, Do You Still Love Me, and One Cup of Coffee. Each one came with lessons. How to use a microphone. How to write under pressure. How to stay steady when the studio clock ticked loud with every dollar spent. Money was tight. Sometimes there wasn't enough to get home after a session. But the Wailers never stopped. They rehearsed with persistence, practiced their harmonies for hours, sometimes singing into empty bottles to train their pitch. Then came a break. Coxsone Dodd heard them perform and invited them to record at Studio One. It was the moment everything began to shift. Studio One was more than a studio, it was a crucible. Everyone who mattered passed through its doors. Singers, musicians, dreamers. In that hot little room, filled with tape reels and cigarette smoke, the Wailers began to become something real. They recorded Simmer Down, a song urging peace among Kingston's warring youth. The rhythm bounced, the lyrics struck a chord, the single climbed Jamaica's charts. For the first time, they had a hit. The Wailers were no longer just a trio of hopefuls. They were a group to watch, and Bob, once a boy from the hills, was becoming a voice of the people. Fame came slowly. Even with Simmer Down climbing the charts, life didn't suddenly change. The Wailers still lived in the same crowded neighborhoods. They still relied on borrowed money and hopeful promises. But there was a new rhythm to their days, a quiet momentum. Studio One became their home base. They recorded there often, experimenting with sounds, sharpening their harmonies, and learning the craft of building songs that would last beyond the moment. The sessions weren't always smooth. The studio was often packed. Equipment was shared. Tensions ran high between rival acts. But Bob, Bunny, and Peter stayed steady. Each had his own drive, but when they sang together, it was one voice. Their early recordings covered a wide emotional range. Some songs carried the heartbreak of young love. Others hinted at deeper frustrations. They were still discovering how to say what needed saying. Bob, especially, was writing more. Pages of lyrics folded into his pocket, stories drawn from the streets, his memories, and something quieter, spiritual. The Wailers weren't just singers, they were becoming writers. But behind the music, life remained hard. They were paid in bits and promises. Coxsone gave them exposure and opportunities, but rarely money. Sometimes they'd get a few pounds, sometimes nothing. Bob began to question the system, so did Peter and Bunny. Still, they kept singing. In these years, they started working with the Soul Brothers, a tight studio band that laid down the tracks, bass, drums, keys, horns. Together they built songs from the ground up. Songs like It Hurts to Be Alone and Put It On showed growing depth and confidence. Their popularity grew, especially among the youth. They weren't polished stars, but they were authentic. People saw themselves in the Wailers. The same struggles, the same fire. Bob's image began to shift too. His hair grew longer, his gaze steadier. He was still humble, still soft in his tone, but there was something in his presence now, a stillness that held weight. But behind the music, the group dynamic was beginning to fray. Bunny had strong ideas about direction. Peter was passionate and unfiltered. Bob was focused and quietly ambitious. The trio still respected each other, but they also started to pull in different directions. They were not yet world famous, but something was changing. The songs were deeper, the harmony tighter, the purpose clearer. and the island, and the world beyond it, was beginning to take notice. By the late 1960s, the Wailers had outgrown the local circuit. They had learned the basics. They had sung in every studio that would open its doors. They had felt the highs of hit songs and the lows of empty pockets. Now they were ready to push further. Bob especially was looking beyond Jamaica. He had begun to sense that reggae, raw and rooted as it was, could speak to the world. But for that to happen, they needed more than talent. They needed structure and support. So the Wailers took a bold step. They broke away from Studio One and decided to manage themselves. They formed their own label, Wayland Solum, a small DIY operation that allowed them to control their recordings, their message, and their income. It was a revolutionary move, though it came with risk. They sold their records directly to fans, packed vinyls in paper sleeves, delivered them to shops by hand. Bob even helped build the small studio they used, hammering nails and painting walls. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Around this time, Bob traveled briefly to the United States. His mother had moved to Wilmington, Delaware, and he went to spend time with her, earning money through odd jobs, working in a factory, sweeping floors, watching the world from behind weary eyes. It gave him perspective, the racism, the pace, the cold. He missed Jamaica. When he returned, the Wailers felt renewed urgency. They recorded songs with sharper edges: Soul Rebel, Duppy Conqueror, Small Axe. These weren't just tunes for the dance hall. They were messages, stories of resistance, of strength, of rising. And Bob's voice was now unmistakable. It didn't wail, it spoke, calm but commanding, steady like water, burning like coal. The group's look evolved too. They wore their Rastafari openly now, dreadlocks, beards, red, gold, and green. They didn't just sing about the movement, they were the movement. Still, international success remained elusive. They had fans, yes. In Jamaica, they were known. In the UK, among Caribbean immigrants, they had a cult following. But the mainstream world had not yet opened its doors. That would come soon. But in this chapter, the forming years, it was all about foundations. Friendship, friction, rebellion, faith. The Wailers had built something no one could ignore. And at the center of it all stood Bob, quietly stepping forward, not as a solo star yet, but as the one with a voice that felt like prophecy. Before the world called him a prophet, Bob Marley fell in love. Her name was Rita. Alpharita Constantia Anderson was a teenage singer when she met Bob. Like him, she lived in Trenchtown. Like him, she knew struggle. And like him, she had music in her bones. Their first conversations were easy, unguarded, filled with laughter and shared silences. Rita had a presence that was grounded and firm. She didn't flutter, she stood. Bob noticed that. They met through the tight circles of Kingston's music scene. Friends of friends, singers drifting between rehearsal yards and church choirs. Rita sang with a group called the Solettes. Bob admired her voice, but even more, he admired her mind. She asked questions. She watched people. She listened not just to words, but to what sat underneath them. Their bond deepened slowly. Bob was never showy with affection. He wasn't the kind to write grand letters or speak in sweeping declarations. But he showed care in quiet ways, walking Rita home, remembering what she liked, defending her when others dismissed her sharp tongue. Rita, in turn, saw through Bob's calm surface. She recognized the intensity beneath it. His music wasn't just ambition, it was mission. And even when they disagreed, and they often did, she believed in him. They married in 1966. A simple ceremony. No grand celebration, just a promise made in the presence of close family, the air warm with rain, the streets humming with distant sound systems. Bob wore a suit, Rita wore white. Neither had much, but both had each other. Shortly after their wedding, Bob received word from his mother in the United States. She invited him to come stay for a while, to work, save money, and build a better future. It was a hard decision. He didn't want to leave Rita. but the promise of a steadier life drew him. He left Jamaica just weeks after their wedding. Rita stayed behind. Those months apart were heavy with longing. Bob worked long hours in a Delaware factory, scrubbing floors and lifting crates. He lived in silence, ate alone, and wrote to Rita when he could. The cold weather bit into him, the streets were unfamiliar, and racism hung in the air like fog. But he kept her picture near his bed. Back in Jamaica, Rita carried on with music. She performed with her group, sang in church, and kept close to Bob's friends. She missed him, but didn't wait passively. Rita was never someone who waited quietly. She moved with her own rhythm. When Bob returned, he brought new eyes. He had seen the world outside. He had walked among strangers and known what it meant to be unseen. His music now carried more weight, more distance, more yearning. And he returned not just to Rita, but to the life they had begun to build. When Bob returned to Jamaica, Rita was waiting. But life did not return to what it had been. Something had shifted in him. He was more focused, more serious, less playful. The time abroad had etched something permanent into his spirit. He spoke more about purpose, about roots, about the fire he felt growing beneath his songs. Rita noticed this right away. Their love had not faded, but it was changing. It wasn't the tender thrill of early romance anymore. It was something harder, more weathered, like a road worn smooth by footsteps. They loved each other, but now they had to learn how to live beside each other. Rita became more involved in Bob's world. She sang on early Wailers recordings, adding harmonies, sometimes uncredited. Her voice was strong, clear and confident. In the studio, she held her ground. When decisions were made, she spoke up. Bob respected that, though he didn't always agree. Their home life was simple: a rented room, a mattress on the floor, a kettle for tea. Music was everywhere. So was hardship. Money came in waves, usually small and brief. Sometimes they skipped meals. Sometimes they argued. But they kept going. Faith became their anchor. Bob was growing deeper into Rastafari, and Rita followed. She read the same texts, attended the same gatherings, asked the same questions. Their dreadlocks grew slowly, and so did their understanding. They no longer just sang about struggle. They lived it, and their belief gave it shape. But the road was not smooth. Bob's attention was pulled in many directions. Music, politics, his growing role as a voice for the people. Rita often felt left behind or pushed to the side. She loved him, but she also wanted to be seen. And Bob, despite his tenderness, was not always steady. Other women entered his life. The nature of his fame and the culture around him made it almost expected. But expected didn't mean easy. Rita knew. She didn't turn away. She stayed. But each time, a little more distance opened between them. Even so, they shared something few couples did. They shared a mission. Rita wasn't just Bob's wife. She was his witness. She saw the moments no one else did. When he couldn't sleep, when lyrics came to him in the middle of the night, when he doubted everything. She was there when the power went out during rehearsals, when promoters didn't pay, when fans turned away, and she stayed. They had children, some together, some from other relationships. The family grew in unexpected shapes. Rita loved all the children as her own. She cooked, she guided, she kept the house alive. Her strength was quiet, steady, like a drumbeat beneath the melody. Bob didn't always say it, but he knew. Without Rita, the rhythm of his life would have faltered. The years passed like wind over water, sometimes still, sometimes crashing. Bob and Rita stood in the center of it all, not untouched, but unshaken. As Bob's music reached further, to London, to Lagos, to Los Angeles, Rita remained the tether that held his soul close to earth. She wasn't just watching his rise, she was part of it. And yet, she walked a more hidden path. The I3s were born from that quiet strength. In the early 1970s, Bob decided to reframe the sound of the Wailers. Peter and Bunny had both left, each seeking his own voice. What emerged in their place was a new harmony, female, strong, and rooted in spirit. Rita, along with Marcia Griffiths and Judy Mowat, became the I3s. Together they sang with power and grace. Rita's voice now echoed behind Bob's on some of his most iconic tracks. No Woman, No Cry, Three Little Birds, Jar Love. Her harmonies didn't just support, they lifted like a current beneath wings. On stage, she stood beside him, not behind him. Her dreadlocks crowned her like a halo. Her gaze was steady. Touring brought both wonder and weariness. Rita saw the world from the back of vans, from backstage doors, from hotel windows. The crowds were enormous, the energy dizzying, but the pace was brutal. She watched Bob pour himself out on stage, night after night, then retreat into silence or solitude. He was always thinking, always writing, always searching, and she followed, not blindly, but with conviction. Their marriage was never easy, but it was never empty. Rita was not only a singer, she became a spiritual guide, a protector, a second heartbeat in the rhythm of Bob's life. When threats came, she was there. When illness whispered, she heard it first. When betrayal knocked, she didn't flinch. She was a lioness, silent but present. There were moments of distance between them, times when Bob was gone, not just physically, but emotionally. Rita felt that space, but she filled it with music, with prayer, with purpose. She raised their children, she helped shape the message, she never let the mission fade. And Bob, in his way, knew he wasn't always faithful, he wasn't always fair, but when he thought of home, he thought of Rita. When he sang of womanhood, of strength, of enduring love, some part of it was always hers. She had stood with him in Trenchtown, barefoot and dreaming. Now she stood with him before the world. By the early 1970s, reggae was stirring beyond Jamaica's shores, but it was Bob Marley who would carry it into the wide world. The turning point came with Island Records. Chris Blackwell, the label's founder, had Jamaican roots and a sharp eye for sound. He saw in Bob something rare, not just a voice or a beat, but a message with weight. He invited Bob to London, he offered a recording contract, and he treated Bob not as a local act, but as a global artist. That mattered. Too often, Caribbean musicians were handed crumbs, small advances, weak promotion, but Bob received something different. Island gave him real studio time, real budgets, real trust. The first fruit of that trust was Catch a Fire. Released in 1973, the album blended reggae's deep pulse with touches of rock, soul, and gospel. It was raw and elegant all at once. Songs like Concrete Jungle and Slave Driver spoke of exile, of pain, of survival, not as headlines but as hymns. To many in the West, it was their first time hearing reggae with such force. The album cover opened like a Zippo lighter. Inside was not just music, but a spark. Bob toured relentlessly to support it. The Wailers, now featuring new musicians, tighter arrangements, and the I3s, played night after night across Europe and America. Many crowds didn't know what to expect. Some had never seen dreadlocks, some didn't understand the words, but the music needed no translation, people felt it. And Bob on stage was magnetic. He didn't dance like a pop star, he moved like someone led by spirit, eyes closed, shoulders swaying, arms raised like branches. When he sang, it wasn't performance, it was prophecy. The world began to notice. Journalists wrote about his quiet power, photographers captured his intensity, fans began to follow not just his songs but his words. His interviews were soft-spoken but pointed. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. Burnin' came next. Another album, another call. It featured Get Up, Stand Up, a defiant anthem, and I Shot the Sheriff, a haunting parable of justice and judgment. The song would later be covered by Eric Clapton, bringing Bob's words into homes that might never have found him on their own. That cover became a gateway. Through it, many found the source. Bob wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing freedom. With every new performance, Bob Marley became more than a musician. He became a movement. The world was shifting in the 1970s. Civil rights battles echoed in America. Anti-colonial voices rose across Africa. Youths in Europe protested war and power, and through it all, Bob's music threaded like a quiet flame. He didn't preach. He sang. But in every lyric, there was a challenge. Songs like Rebel Music, 3 O'Clock Roadblock captured the suffocation of systems. Them Bellyful But We Hungry gave voice to the unheard. These weren't just catchy rhythms, they were reflections of a world cracking under pressure. Bob wasn't just writing for Jamaicans now, he was writing for anyone who had ever felt caged. The Wailers' tour schedules grew longer, their venues larger. From small theatres to vast concert halls, they filled the spaces with rhythm and fire. The crowds changed too. Black, white, rich, poor, dreadlocked youth and curious elders. All drawn by something they couldn't quite name, but deeply felt. The music was simple in structure, but layered in spirit. And through all of it, Bob stayed close to his roots. Even as the band travelled across continents, he carried Jamaica with him. In his speech, in his style, in his beliefs, he didn't shed the island, he carried it like a banner. Back home, not everyone celebrated his rising fame. Some accused him of selling out, of softening reggae to suit foreign ears. But Bob refused to apologize. He wasn't changing the message, he was carrying it further. In 1975, the release of Natty Dread solidified that path. This was Bob's first album without Bunny and Peter. It was his voice, fully his own. Songs like Lively Up Yourself, So Ya Say, and No Woman, No Cry showed new dimensions of joy, of mourning, of survival. No Woman, No Cry became a hymn. The live version, recorded at the Lyceum in London, captured something eternal. The crowd sang with him, not as fans, but as companions. In every line, you could hear pain wrapped in comfort, struggle wrapped in hope. That song, gentle, steady, travelled farther than any bullet ever could. Island Records saw the potential. They poured more into promotion, more into visuals. Bob's face began to appear in magazines, on posters, on dorm walls. His image, the deep eyes, the lion's mane of hair, became a symbol. But Bob never chased the image. He lived the mission. Every concert was a gathering, every lyric a call, and every silence between songs held more than words could say. By 1976, Bob Marley was no longer just a voice, he was a symbol, and symbols come with a price. Jamaica was at a boiling point. Political tension had split the island in two, the People's National Party on one side, the Jamaica Labour Party on the other. Violence flared daily, gunmen roamed openly, neighbourhoods were torn apart by loyalty and fear. Bob tried to stay above it, but he couldn't stay untouched. His music spoke of unity, of one love, of no chains, no boundaries. But to some that made him dangerous. He was too influential, too independent, and too beloved by the poor. That year, Bob agreed to perform at the Smile Jamaica concert, a free show meant to ease tension before a national election. It was backed by the government. That made him a target. 2 nights before the concert, gunmen stormed Bob's home. Bullets sprayed the walls. Rita was shot in the head, narrowly surviving. Bob was grazed, blood streaking his chest and arm. It was an ambush meant to silence. But it didn't. 2 days later, with stitches hidden beneath a denim jacket and pain tucked deep inside, Bob stepped onto the stage. He performed for over an hour. When asked why, he said quietly, "The people who are trying to make this world worse aren't taking a day off. How can I?" That moment, barefoot, wounded, unwavering, was broadcast across the island and across the world. It was no longer about records now, or sales, or shows. It was about courage. After the concert, Bob left Jamaica. He didn't run, he regrouped. He flew to London, carrying his wounds like quiet luggage. In the fog and rain of that cold city, he began to write again. New songs, new visions, and from that solitude came something extraordinary. The album was called Exodus. Released in 1977, it was both departure and declaration. The title alone said it all, a movement away from Babylon towards something sacred. It was political, spiritual, and deeply human. The songs were unforgettable. Jamming, Waiting in Vain, Three Little Birds, One Love. Each one different, yet all flowing like one river. Side A was thunder, side B was sunrise. Together they marked a new chapter. The world took notice. Exodus was hailed as one of the greatest albums of all time. Time magazine called it the album of the century. And Bob, quiet, steady Bob, had become a global voice for change. But he still missed home. Jamaica lived in his veins, the music carried it, the memories carried it. And soon he would return. Not in fear, but in peace. London was cold, not just in weather, but in spirit. Bob had fled there not to escape, but to breathe. After the attack in Kingston, after the blood and the fear, he needed space. He needed silence. And in London's grey skies and narrow streets he found both. He settled in a quiet house on Oakley Street, near the Chelsea Bridge. It was a grand house by Jamaican standards, wide, with brick walls and thick carpets. But Bob filled it with warmth. Incense burned. Friends visited. Music never stopped. He was in exile, but not in hiding. The Wailers, now a fluid collective of musicians, gathered there. Rita came too, though often only for a time. So did the I3s. The band rehearsed in the living room, guitars buzzing, drums echoing off the walls, laughter drifted through the halls. So did fatigue, but above it all was the sound of creation. Bob was writing Exodus not as an album, but as a message. Each track was a thread in something larger, a story of flight, of struggle, of spiritual return. The first half burned with politics, the second half flowed with love. He rose early most mornings, long before the city stirred. He would pace barefoot across the carpet, mumbling lines, humming melodies. Then he would sit, sometimes for hours, refining a single verse, chasing the right vibration. He believed every word mattered. Visitors came and went, musicians, poets, activists, all drawn to the quiet storm inside that house. Bob listened more than he spoke. He would nod, smile. And then, hours later, a new line would appear in a song that reflected what had been said. Outside, London rushed by. But inside, time moved like smoke. The songs poured forth. Exodus, with its deep groove and call to movement. Jamming, joyful and unshaken. Waiting in vain, tender with longing. Three Little Birds, simple as breath. And One Love, reimagined, more grounded, more resolute. He wasn't chasing a hit, he was planting seeds. Each song was a prayer, each note a step toward home. Exodus was released in June of 1977. And the world listened. It wasn't just another reggae record, it was something larger, a tapestry of rhythm, faith, defiance, and tenderness. Critics praised its depth, fans played it endlessly. Even those unfamiliar with Bob's earlier work felt the weight of it. But while the album soared, Bob's body began to falter. One day, while playing football in a London park, a favourite pastime that brought him joy and stillness, he took a hard step and collapsed. At first, it seemed like a minor injury, a stubbed toe, nothing serious, but it didn't heal. The pain deepened. Doctors discovered something far more grave, melanoma, a rare and aggressive form. It had started under his toenail, likely years before, and now it was spreading. Bob didn't stop. He continued rehearsing, continued performing, continued writing, but something had changed. The knowledge sat quietly inside him, like a passenger he could not shake. He didn't talk about it much. When he did, it was with a calm that unsettled those around him. He believed in Jah, in destiny, in the journey beyond flesh. But others worried. His team urged treatment. Some doctors recommended amputation. Bob refused. To him, it wasn't just a medical issue, it was spiritual, a matter of balance, of belief. His body was not just his, it was part of his purpose. Instead, he pressed on. The band toured Europe, played sold-out shows, brought Exodus to life on stage. Bob stood firm, night after night, hiding pain behind movement, behind sound. The crowd never knew, or maybe they did, in some deeper way. They sang louder, held on longer, and Bob, ever humble, ever distant, gave them everything. He never begged for sympathy, never shifted the spotlight. He simply moved forward. Meanwhile, Exodus kept rising. One Love became a global anthem. Three Little Birds offered comfort like sunlight through a storm. The album was named Album of the Year by multiple publications. It played in clubs, in kitchens, in embassies, and on picket lines. It was not just an album, it was an exhale. Bob had carried so much: exile, faith, violence, dreams, and Exodus had released it all. But even as his star rose, the question remained: would he go home? Jamaica was calling. Despite everything, the bullet wounds, the betrayals, the fear, Bob felt the pull of home like gravity. He could not stay in exile forever. The political storm that had once torn the island apart was beginning to ease. Leaders from both parties, weary from bloodshed, saw in Bob a figure of peace. Not neutral, but unifying. His return could be a balm, a signal. So in early 1978, Bob returned. His plane touched down quietly. No parade, no headlines, just mist and heat and the breath of the island beneath his feet. People gathered anyway. At the airport, in the streets, outside his home. Word traveled fast. The lion had come home. Bob stepped out of the terminal with calm eyes, no armor, just presence. He walked back into his life like he had never left it. But Jamaica had changed, and so had he. He stayed mostly at 56 Hope Road, his old home, now a compound for music, meetings, meditation. Friends came and went. So did strangers. Some came for blessings, others for business. Some came just to see him, to stand in his light for a moment. Bob welcomed them all, but he didn't speak much. He was watching, listening, waiting for the right time. That time came on April 22nd, 1978, the One Love Peace Concert. Held at the National Stadium in Kingston, it was a gathering unlike any other. Musicians from across Jamaica, across genres, came together to sing, dance, and try, even for one night, to heal. Bob agreed to perform, but he wanted more than a show. He wanted a moment, and he made one. Midway through his set, in the middle of jamming, Bob paused. He called for two men to join him on stage, Michael Manley, the Prime Minister, and Edward Seager, the opposition leader. The crowd fell silent. Both men hesitated, then walked forward, and there, in front of thousands, Bob joined their hands, together above his head. For one long breath, the violence, the politics, the fear, it all fell away. It was just three men, two hands, one love. Bob didn't say much afterward. He didn't need to. The image circled the globe. By now, Bob Marley was more than a musician. He was a myth woven into living skin. His songs reached every corner of the earth, from cramped apartments in London to dusty villages in Ghana, from college dorm rooms to prison yards. His image, with its piercing eyes and tangled crown, became a mirror for millions who longed for freedom, or healing, or truth. But for Bob, fame was never the destination. It was just a doorway. He believed in the teachings of Rastafari more deeply than ever. His dreadlocks grew long, untouched by scissors, wrapped by faith. He spoke less of politics and more of Babylon, the corrupt system, the false idols, the spiritual traps of modern life. His words now moved with a slower rhythm like scripture. He studied more, read constantly, scriptures, history, African philosophy. He wasn't trying to be a preacher, but his questions had grown bigger, and so had his message. One Love wasn't just a slogan, it was a vision. Unity, not uniformity. Harmony, not silence. A world where justice grew not from courts or campaigns, but from compassion. That was what Bob sang for, and people followed. In the late 1970s, his concerts became pilgrimages. Fans came not just to hear, but to feel. They stood shoulder to shoulder in fields, in stadiums, in rain. They closed their eyes and raised their hands, not in worship of Bob, but in something deeper. Connection. He had become a bridge between Africa and the Caribbean, between the spiritual and the political, between suffering and joy, but the bridge carried weight. Bob never took days off. He wrote constantly, rehearsed even when exhausted, said yes to every opportunity. He felt urgency, though he rarely named it, as if he knew, deep in his bones, that time was not a luxury he would be given. His family life reflected that tension. Rita remained the foundation, but Bob's other relationships with women, with children, spiraled outward like the branches of a great tree. Some called it chaos, others called it truth. He never pretended to live a simple life, but he tried always to live an honest one. He fathered many children, each with a piece of his heart. He wasn't always present, but he cared deeply, and he tried, even through distance, to guide them. Meanwhile, his words carried further. War, adapted from a speech by Haile Selassie, rang like thunder. Redemption song whispered like prayer. These weren't hits, they were hymns, and Bob, through it all, remained humble. He still walked barefoot, still played football with strangers, still ate Ital food and sat in silence. He wasn't a star to himself, just a servant. As Bob's music circled the globe, so did his message. He was invited to speak with world leaders, to meet with revolutionaries, to sit at tables lined with silver, where once he might have been denied a seat entirely. But Bob was careful. He accepted few invitations. He trusted his instincts, not titles. He spoke plainly, even in grand rooms. When asked what he thought of politics, he spoke of people. When asked about religion, he spoke of righteousness. He never claimed to have answers, but he lived as if the questions mattered. In Africa, his songs became rallying cries. In Zimbabwe, his music was played on underground radio stations during the struggle for independence. When the country finally gained its freedom in 1980, Bob was invited to perform at the celebration in Salisbury. It was no ordinary concert. It was a beginning. Soldiers stood guard around the stage. Dignitaries sat in folding chairs. Bob sang not for ceremony, but for history. And when he sang Zimbabwe, a song written before the victory, people wept. His voice had arrived before he did, but even moments like that didn't slow him down. He toured Europe, Asia, the Americas. He traveled not for fame, but to plant seeds. Each place he touched grew new followers. Some came for the music, others for the message. All left changed. Still, Bob carried his illness like a shadow. The cancer that had begun in his toe was no longer quiet. It had moved to his brain, to his liver, to his lungs. The pain came in waves now, sharp, sudden. Some days he could barely walk. Other days he danced like nothing was wrong. He refused to stop. In 1980, Bob and the Wailers embarked on the Uprising tour. It would be their last. They performed in massive venues: Vienna, Milan, Paris, New York. The crowds grew, but so did the silence between shows. Backstage, Bob often sat alone. He didn't talk about the pain. He just closed his eyes and listened. Sometimes he meditated, sometimes he prayed, sometimes he just breathed. He was making peace, piece by piece. Still, he gave everything on stage. He sang with force, even when his body trembled. He smiled for fans, even when he had no strength left. Every performance felt like a gift, from him to them, and from them back to him. He knew the end was near, but he never rushed. In the final stretch of his journey, Bob began to move inward. The fire in him still burned, but it flickered now, gentler, more reflective. He spent long hours in silence, not withdrawn, just quiet, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. At home in Jamaica, he sat under trees for hours, sometimes with family, sometimes with old friends. He smiled often, laughed softly, and spoke less. The man who once sang of rebellion now sang of redemption. The album Uprising became his final testament. It was filled with grace. Redemption song stood at the center, a farewell, a reflection, a release. It was unlike anything he had written before. No drums, no bass line, just Bob and his guitar. "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery," he sang. "None but ourselves can free our minds." Those words floated far beyond the studio. They reached classrooms, protests, bedrooms, prisons. They became mantra, scripture. And yet for Bob they were deeply personal. He was setting his own soul free, even as his body weakened. By late 1980, the illness could no longer be hidden. He collapsed while jogging in Central Park. He was rushed to the hospital. The cancer had spread too far. Treatment could ease the pain but not cure the cause. Still, Bob resisted despair. He traveled to Germany seeking holistic healing at a clinic near Munich. The cold mountain air was sharp. The days were quiet. Rita stayed nearby, so did some of his children. The world outside waited, prayed, watched. But Bob was not afraid. He said little of death. When asked, he simply replied, "Your guide." In May of 1981, Bob decided to return home. His body was failing fast, but his spirit was clear. He wanted to die in Jamaica near the roots that had made him. He never made it. He passed away in Miami, surrounded by family, on May 11th. The world mourned. He was 36, young by any measure. But timeless in every way. His body was flown back to Jamaica. A state funeral was held. Heads of state came. So did farmers, teachers, children, musicians, Rastafarians with red, gold, green banners, Christians with hymn books, people who had nothing in common except Bob. They sang him home. His casket was carried through the streets, through hills, past crowds, to 9 miles. The place where it all began. And there, in the soil that had once held his bare feet, Bob Marley was laid to rest. Not with silence, but with song. Long before the stadium filled, the city held its breath. April 22nd, 1978. The sun hung low over Kingston, thick with heat and tension. For weeks the island had buzzed with talk of the One Love Peace concert. Some saw it as a gimmick, others called it dangerous, but to many, especially those whose lives moved to the beat of Bob Marley's song, it was hope. The National Stadium stood ready, rows of concrete seats, worn grass, makeshift barriers. Security teams fanned out, not for fame, but for safety. In the streets beyond, gunmen still moved. The wounds of past years had not healed. But people came anyway. They came from every corner of the island, from Spanish Town, from Montego Bay, from the foothills of St. Anne. They came barefoot, in pressed shirts, in red, gold, green head wraps. They carried radios, flags, flowers, and no small amount of fear. The stage rose like a ship in the middle of the field. As the sun dropped, the stadium lit up. The concert began with local acts. Singers, toasters, soundmen, each bringing rhythm and fire. The crowd swayed, cheered, listened. Some danced, others stood still, arms crossed, waiting for the man they had come to see. Bob. Backstage, he waited in silence. He had not performed in Jamaica since the shooting. He bore the scars still. One in his chest, one in his arm, and others unseen. But his eyes were calm. He spoke little, just nodded, smiled faintly. His band gathered quietly around him. The I3s hummed softly. Then the moment came. Bob stepped onto the stage as if stepping into a sacred space. The crowd erupted. Cheers, screams, hands to the sky. He raised one fist, then let it fall. The music started. Rastaman vibration. The beat rolled out like thunder. His voice, firm and full, carried across the night, through speakers, through sweat, through fear. Each word felt like balm, each note a binding thread. There was no ceremony, no politics, just the music. And yet it was deeply political. The air was charged, not just with sound, but with potential. Everyone sensed it. Something was coming. Bob stood steady at the center of the stage, surrounded by rhythm and tension. The music pulsed. The band moved with him, tight and sure, each note a step deeper into something larger than sound. The I3s swayed behind him like ancient trees in wind. Their harmonies wrapped around his voice like water around stone. And Bob, barefoot, shirt open, body scarred, sang with a fire that softened rather than burned. The crowd responded like a single heart. They shouted every line, they wept, They danced in place. Some stood frozen, tears in their eyes. Old men, young boys, women cradling babies. The music wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine. Then came the moment. Bob paused mid-set. The rhythm faded, the lights dimmed. He spoke. Not in a preacher's voice, not in a politician's, just Bob, calm, grounded, eyes locked on the crowd. He called for unity. Not vague peace, but real, lasting healing. He called for two men to join him, Michael Manley, Edward Seeger, leaders of the rival political parties, enemies, some would say. The stadium hushed. You could hear breath. You could feel the weight. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, they stepped forward. First one, then the other. The crowd held still, every heartbeat waiting. Bob took their hands, one in each of his. He raised them into the air, not as a gesture, but as a prayer. The crowd erupted, not in frenzy, but in relief. Some laughed, some cried, some simply stood in silence, their hands over their hearts. For just that one breath in time, it seemed the island could be whole again. The flashbulbs popped, the cameras captured it. But what mattered most was what could not be seen. The quiet lifting of fear, the soft cracking open of hope. Bob didn't speak after that. He let the music carry the rest. Jamming returned. The groove rolled on, and people danced, not just for joy, but for peace. The concert carried on, but something had changed. That single act, two hands raised above a sea of faces, had turned a performance into a promise. No one forgot it. Not the crowd, not the country, not Bob. He sang the rest of the set with his whole body. His voice, already strong, took on a deeper tone, not louder but fuller, as if it carried the breath of everyone watching. Songs flowed one into the next. War, Crazy Baldhead, Natural Mystic. The band played with precision and soul. Every bass line was a heartbeat, every drum beat a footstep, every guitar lick a breeze in hot night air. The I3s moved with reverence, their voices rising like smoke. Together, they created something sacred. And the crowd, they became part of the rhythm, not passive, but active, not just listening, but joining. It was more than a concert. It was communion. Bob didn't stay long after the final chord. He didn't bask in applause. He didn't wave or linger. He walked off stage the way he walked on, calm, barefoot, carrying something bigger than himself. Backstage, he embraced the band, thanked the crew, sat quietly for a moment. He didn't talk about what had happened. He didn't need to. Outside, the city exhaled. The night passed without violence. People walked home singing. Some held hands with strangers. Some wept in silence. In homes across Jamaica, radios replayed the moment. On stoops and balconies, people whispered, "Did you see it?" News spread fast. Newspapers printed the photo. Bob with both leaders' hands in his. Commentators called it brave. Some called it foolish, but most simply called it unforgettable. For days afterward, there was stillness. No gunshots, no sirens. Just breathe, just music. It didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough to remind a wounded nation what peace could feel like. And that was enough for now. Bob returned home that night and sat on the porch, barefoot in the dark. A candle flickered beside him. The sound of frogs and crickets filled the space. He didn't say a word. He just listened. By the end of 1980, Bob Marley was still moving, still singing, still showing up, still carrying his message across cities and continents. But something inside him was beginning to slow. The pain, once distant, was now constant. He walked with care, climbed stairs with effort. On some days he smiled through it. On others he vanished into silence. The cancer had spread. Few knew how far. Bob spoke little of illness. He didn't want pity. He didn't want eyes full of sadness. He wanted to live as long as he could, with as much purpose as he could. So he kept performing. The Uprising Tour became his final journey. The crowds were massive. Vienna, Milan, Paris, New York. Each show carried a strange mix of joy and gravity. People came to celebrate, to dance. But some felt it, a kind of farewell stitched into the music. Bob never said it outright, but those closest to him knew. In New York, he played his last show at Madison Square Garden. The crowd was electric. Bob moved with grace, if not ease. His voice rang out strong, but between songs he paused more often, breathing deeper, holding his side. A few days later, he collapsed while jogging in Central Park. He was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was clear. The cancer had reached his brain, his lungs, his liver. There was little more to do. Still, Bob refused to stop. He returned to Miami, then to Germany, where a clinic offered alternative treatments, holistic care, herbs, quiet. The mountains outside Munich were cold and still. A different world. Rita visited. So did Ziggy. So did old friends. He lost weight. His face grew narrow, but his spirit stayed full. He wrote letters, played guitar softly in the afternoons, meditated, prayed. Doctors watched in wonder. He shouldn't have lasted this long. But he did, because of faith, because of love, because of something else they couldn't name. Bob once said, "You never know how strong you are until being strong is your only choice." Now he was living it. Every day was a quiet act of courage. The clinic in Germany sat on a quiet hillside, surrounded by forest and fog. Inside, Bob moved like a ghost of his former self. Slower, thinner, but still dignified. The staff spoke in soft voices. The halls smelled of pine and tea. Each day unfolded gently, like snow falling on branches. Rita stayed nearby, her presence unwavering. She helped with meals, read scriptures aloud, massaged his aching legs. She didn't cry, at least not where he could see. Instead, she sang softly. Old gospel songs, hymns they both remembered from childhood. Bob would smile, eyes closed, letting the sound carry him. Ziggy visited too. He was still just a boy, but old enough to see what was happening. Bob took his hand in his own and whispered what words he could. He didn't speak of death. He spoke of roots, of fire, of music, of carrying the message forward. Other visitors came, musicians, friends, spiritual guides. They brought stories, laughter, small comforts. Bob listened more than he spoke. His strength was fading, but his clarity deepened. He often sat near the window, looking out over the hills, as if watching the world exhale. Letters arrived from all corners of the globe, from fans, from leaders, from strangers who had danced to his music in dark times and now offered him light. The letters were read aloud, line by line. Some made him laugh, some brought tears. Each one reminded him his life had mattered, and yet the pain grew sharper. Even simple movements became difficult. His hands, once so agile with guitar strings, trembled. His legs, once sure on stage, weakened. But he endured it with grace. No complaints, just stillness. The doctors did all they could. Natural remedies, herbal treatments, careful diets, warm baths. Nothing stopped the cancer, but something slowed it. Something inside Bob himself. One evening, a nurse found him sitting alone, humming to himself. A quiet melody. When asked what he was singing, he said only, "A new one." Even now, the music hadn't left him. It never would. By spring of 1981, Bob knew the time was close. He had fought quietly for years, not with rage, but with grace. Now his body whispered what he had long understood. The journey was ending. He asked to go home. Not to the stage, not to the crowd, but to Jamaica, to 9 miles, to the hills where he had learned to listen to the wind. The doctors warned him it would be too much, the travel, the strain, but Bob insisted there was still a part of him, small, steady, that believed he could make it. That maybe the land itself would hold him long enough for one last sunrise. He left Germany with Rita and close family. They flew to Miami to rest before continuing. But the final crossing never came. Bob's condition worsened rapidly. The pain spiked. His breath grew shallow, his words fewer. Yet his spirit remained. In those final days, Rita never left his side. She held his hand. She brushed his hair. She sang to him. On May 11th, 1981, Bob Marley drew his last breath. The room was quiet. No fanfare, no final speech. Just the hush of parting, the peace of surrender. His final words, spoken to his son Ziggy, were simple: "Money can't buy life." He was 36. News spread like fire. Jamaica wept. So did Africa, Europe, the Americas. Tribes in Kenya played his music for days. Children in Harlem lit candles. Presidents issued statements. Musicians fell silent. And fans, millions of them, held each other and cried. He was not just a singer, he was a shepherd of spirit. Jamaica held a state funeral. His casket was draped in the Ethiopian flag. The procession wound through Kingston, past the places he had lived, past crowds that lined the streets like riverbanks. People threw flowers, sang his songs, touched the hearse as it passed. They carried him home, back to 9 Miles. There, in the hills where he had been born, Bob was laid to rest. His grave was built near his childhood home. Inside were a guitar, a Bible, a stalk of ganja, and his words, sealed into the silence. The land received him like an old friend, and the world has not been the same since. The hills of 9 Miles held their breath, not out of sorrow, but reverence. Bob Marley had returned to the soil that first shaped his barefoot steps, the same hills where he had learned to listen, to sing, to believe. Now they cradled him once more, this time in stillness. But even in death, Bob did not disappear. He expanded. The music played on, across radios, across oceans, in places he had never walked. His voice carried through generations, not like a ghost, but like a guide. Jamaica remembered first. In the years after his passing, murals bloomed on concrete walls, his face in red, gold and green, his words painted above storefronts, carved into benches, whispered in prayer. His music became part of the island's bloodstream, no longer just art, but history. Tourists came by the thousands, to walk where he walked, to stand where he stood, to breathe the air he breathed. Some came for curiosity, some for pilgrimage. All left with something changed. 9 Miles, once a quiet village, became a sanctuary. His childhood home was preserved, humble, wooden, painted in bright colors. Inside, the air smelled of incense and polished wood. His bed, his guitar, his books, still there, still waiting. The mausoleum nearby, cool and round, held his remains. A lion carved in stone stood watch. People entered quietly. Some cried, some smiled, some sang. Each one brought something of themselves, because Bob's story was no longer just his. It belonged to anyone who had struggled, anyone who had hoped, anyone who had believed that music could mend something broken. And in that way, he lived on. Beyond 9 Miles, the world carried his rhythm forward. Bob Marley became more than an artist to remember. He became a compass, pointing not north, but inward. His music didn't just endure, it grew. Each decade brought new listeners. Children heard him through their parents' speakers. Teens found him in dorm rooms and on dusty vinyls. Activists quoted his lyrics on protest signs. Elders nodded knowingly when Redemption Song played on the radio. He was no longer tied to any one country. He belonged to the planet. And everywhere he was heard, something softened. His voice, untrained, unpolished, but real, reached across borders and into the ache of human lives. Whether someone lived in Kingston or Kyoto, Rio or Detroit, they found in Bob a friend, not perfect, not sainted, just true. Reggae became global. Festivals sprang up in his name. Statues were raised. Bob Marley Day was declared in cities far from the Caribbean. Scholars studied his lyrics. Poets borrowed his rhythm. Generations found in his songs not nostalgia, but relevance. The Marley family carried the torch. Ziggy, Stephen, Damien, and others took the stage with their own voices, not copies, but continuations, each honoring the message in their own way, each reminding the world that the roots still lived. Rita, ever strong, preserved his legacy. She oversaw the estate, protected the music, kept the mission clear. She built schools, clinics, and sanctuaries. She turned grief into growth, loss into light. And the house at 56 Hope Road became a museum. People walked its halls with quiet steps. The studio still held echoes. The kitchen still smelled faintly of spices. Tour guides spoke softly, as if the air itself remembered him. Everywhere Bob had walked, the earth seemed to hum. and in the hum you could still hear his message. One love, one heart, let's get together and feel all right. In the years that followed, Bob Marley remained, not in flesh, but in spirit. You could hear him in the soft strum of a guitar on a porch, in the hum of a taxi driver's radio, in the quiet courage of someone choosing truth over comfort. He became part of the air. Everywhere his music went, something shifted. A wound closed, a wall softened, a tear turned into strength. Even those who didn't speak his language understood, because Bob didn't just make songs, he made space. Space for pain, for joy, for resistance, for healing. He reminded the world that greatness didn't come from having power. It came from giving it away, from singing when your throat is dry, from standing when your knees shake. He taught that love was not soft. It was steel wrapped in warmth. And though the world would go on to crown many more stars, none sang quite like Bob. None carried silence between notes the way he did. None made millions dance and weep in the same breath. He left behind no riches, no towers, no empires, just a message, a melody, and a legacy woven into the very heartbeat of the world. Somewhere in the hills of 9 miles, the wind still rustles the banana leaves, and if you listen closely, really listen, you might hear him. Not singing, just breathing, still here, still guiding. Forever the lion.